Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. And I hope you've been well. Today, and next episode too, actually, I want to talk about why Platonic love is, in a way, so hard for us these days in the contemporary era, and why this is something that's actually deeply concerning, I think. And by Platonic love, of course, I mean Plato's actual teaching on eros that we've been looking at so much, which is, if one could put it extremely briefly, that human desire is ultimately satisfied by nothing other than immediate, or you could say, ecstatic cognition of the good. I'm going to kick off this two-part discussion by giving two examples of fairly high-profile philosophers from our era who, in my opinion, seem to have missed what I think actually is Platonism's great gift to the world. I mean, I believe it's at the core of that hope that Plato has to offer us. So I'm talking about these two philosophers today, partly because I think I'd be pretty remiss not to talk about them in connection, or at least the point they're trying to make, in connection with the dialogue we've been looking at lately. If you've been following this series, you'll probably remember that that dialogue is the Phaedrus, and that in the last few episodes in particular, we've been focusing quite a bit on this trust Socrates seems to place in what might be called immediate cognition, this kind of mental activity that doesn't seem to really depend on abstractions, on a chain of reasoning. So, intuition or feeling. It's what we experience when things just seem to present themselves to the mind. And Socrates expresses this in various ways. He gives various examples of it, like this inspiration of the muses in art, for example, or the action of what he calls his daimonic sign that comes to him from time to time. And he basically summarizes it in the Phaedrus by calling it mania. And while some kinds of mania, of course, are harmful, other kinds, he says, are sent by the gods. They bring blessings to mortals. And we'll see that one of these forms of God-sent mania is, or can be, eros. The Phaedrus, of course, isn't the only place we see Socrates express this trust in or reliance on immediate cognition. It's something that pops up from time to time throughout the dialogues. And actually, a notable other occurrence would be the other dialogue we've spent a lot of time on in this series, the Symposium, Plato's other great erotic dialogue. But the Phaedrus, I think, is where we see it most starkly, even you might say kind of startlingly, at least I think for many of us, because it seems to fly in the face of what we understand philosophy to be, this purely rational process. This tendency that Socrates displays, and that Plato therefore seems to implicitly embrace, hasn't been easy for modern philosophers to get their heads around. Particularly, I think, those in the Anglo-American tradition. In his 1945 History of Western Philosophy, Bertrand Russell concedes that some sort of immediate cognition is necessary, some sort of intellectual vision of the whole, when, as he puts it, quote, after long labor, truth or beauty appears, or seems to appear, in a sudden glory. And by the way, it's funny, I can't help but be reminded by this phrase of Russell's, of Plato's seventh letter. Do you remember that, when he talks about the heart of his teaching coming to the mind suddenly, after long effort, the way a leaping spark kindles a blazing fire? Anyway, so Bertrand Russell concedes that some sort of vision like this, some sort of mental experience like this is necessary to produce stuff of value. He writes, the experience is at the moment very convincing. Doubt may come later, but at the time there's utter certainty. I think most of the best creative work in art, in science, in literature and in philosophy has been the result of such a moment. Whether it comes to others as to me, I cannot say. For my part, I've found that when I wish to write a book on some subject, I must first soak myself in detail until all the separate parts of the subject matter are familiar. Then, someday, if I am fortunate, I perceive the whole, with all its parts duly interrelated. After that, I only have to write down what I have seen. The nearest analogy is first walking all over a mountain in a mist, until every path and ridge and valley is separately familiar, and then from a distance, seeing the mountain whole and clear in bright sunshine. However, Russell continues, there's a folly and even a danger in allowing ourselves to draw conclusions from these experiences, of these unitive experiences, when we seem to see things in their oneness. This experience, I believe, is necessary to good creative work, but it is not sufficient. Indeed, the subjective certainty that it brings with it may be fatally misleading. He writes, William James describes a man who got the experience from laughing gas. Whenever he was under its influence, he knew the secret of the universe, but when he came to, he had forgotten it. At last, with immense effort, he wrote down the secret before the vision had faded. When completely recovered, he rushed to see what he had written. It was, quote, a smell of petroleum prevails throughout, unquote. What seems like sudden insight may be misleading and must be tested soberly when the divine intoxication has passed. That's what Russell wrote. A few pages later in the same book, Russell seems to suggest that Plato unwisely bases his philosophy on this type of cognition, a kind of mystical experience that results in an unwarranted assumption, in Plato's case, that the good, as he wrote in the Republic, is the principle of everything. And so Russell seems to see Plato as internally conflicted, as torn by a conflict between reason and mysticism that he was never able to resolve. And Russell writes, the underlying assumption is that reality, as opposed to appearance, is completely and perfectly good. To perceive the good, therefore, is to perceive reality. Throughout Plato's philosophy, there is the same fusion of intellect and mysticism as in Pythagoreanism. But at this final culmination, mysticism clearly has the upper hand. So Russell is saying Plato deeply felt that the good must be the principle of everything. And so that's why he made it the principle of everything, even without being able to support this claim. And so for Russell, there's this unresolved conflict between reason and feeling or intuition at the very heart of Plato's system. He wasn't able to synthesize them, and so one had to prevail over the other. 70 years later, the American academic and writer Rebecca Goldstein made a remarkably similar contention in her 2014 book on Plato, Plato at the Googleplex. And you may have come across or read that sort of philosophy written for a sort of popular audience. Like Russell, Goldstein sees rational and immediate cognition as two sides that seem to wrestle for supremacy in Plato. Socrates' appeal to his daimon, she says, quote, raises epistemological flags, and I guess she means red ones. How, she asks, is one to know whether this private voice, as peremptorily as it presents itself in the inner chambers of Socrates' mind, is reliable, It feels reliable to Socrates, but so it always is, with those peremptory inner voices. And she goes on to note Plato's tendency to identify truth with the beautiful. She writes a few pages later of inner voices and other highly individual, immediate experiences of apparent truth, quote, "Perhaps these singular experiences are nothing more than the floating vapors of hallucinations, the emanations of diseased minds, even if they do sometimes result in visions of beauty, or even, as it was with Socrates, a life of beauty," unquote. I think it would be hard to argue with the idea that we can depend on whatever ideas emerge out of emotion or out of altered states of consciousness as being true and dependable. I mean, it would be hard to concede that we can depend on whatever ideas arise out of them to be true and dependable. I've spoken earlier in this series about the role that immediate cognition and this craving we humans have for oneness, for a closer contact with reality than we have in abstraction, the role that that plays in religious fanaticism and totalitarianism, and the various individual and communal nightmares that have issued from those things. And of course, Plato himself is well aware that not all manic states will bestow truth on those who experience them. After all, when Socrates says he's not a good seer, he thereby implies some seers are better than others. And when he says mania is good if it's sent from the gods, we can certainly infer that he understands that some manic states are not good. And we know from having read the Republic that Plato believes the claims of the poets need to be put to the test of dialectic, of logical analysis, before they can be accepted. And then last but not least, of course, Plato's fond of talking about immediate cognition in the form of hubris, passion, as the very principle of vice in the individual, as we've seen him do in this very dialogue in the Phaedrus, and the community also, as we see him do in the Republic. Whatever Plato is saying when he seems to lend credence to immediate cognition, he is certainly not saying that whatever thought we have that emerges from feeling, or what we might call intuition or an altered state of consciousness, is necessarily true. For her part, Goldstein is well aware that Plato is leery of this, of what you might call feeling or intuition, and she sees his myth of the cave, for example, as a kind of antidote to easy, impulsive thinking. But like Russell, she's unable to see Plato as having ever really resolved this problem of, in a way, divided loyalties to the truth as worked out by reason and the truth as it seems to immediately present itself to us sometimes. Or as she puts it, the call of the reasonable on the one hand and the unreasonable on the other. And culture in the West since his time, she believes, has been similarly torn. She writes, quote, "Plato's divided soul has come down to us through the millennia, its component parts segregated into two oppositional camps, glaring at each other with mutual suspicion," unquote, in the forms, for example, of science and religion today. Goldstein takes what Plato calls divine mania and what I've been calling immediate cognition as essentially subjective, and also as the domain of the, in her words, privileged few. This, even though, as we saw, Socrates in the Phaedrus says he believes the psyche to be a seer or a mantis by its very nature, and so not just of the privileged few. Mania is not just of the privileged few. Goldstein sees it as therefore essentially outside the realm of objective science or philosophy, and the lending of credence to it is also, she writes, extremely dangerous. There are strong, oh so strong, reasons to affirm, she writes, that yes, we ought to exclude privileged points of view as we seek to know the world. No claim to knowledge should be allowed a free pass, getting by without giving an account of itself. Subjectivity is a breeding ground for prejudice, superstition, and egotistical self-aggrandizement. We are too prone to favoring our own particularity, and if we are talented enough, can raise up a cunningly convincing ideology that will shape all the world to fit our particular dimensions. It is a dangerous mistake to allow subjectivity to strut its stuff with such smug thuggishness. Exposing our most cherished beliefs to the rough treatment of multiple points of view, each of which is prone to see the world from the vantage of its own advantage, is our only hope for defeating the hazards of self-serving subjectivity, complacent at best, murderously certain at worst. And so philosophy, as Plato had conceived it with one half of his divided soul, she writes, has typically been saying yes to the exclusion of privileged points of view. So Russell and Goldstein, writing 70 years apart, see more or less the same problem with Plato, in my view. They see him as wrestling or conflicted over this, as having failed to reconcile these two apparently opposed elements of the psyche or moments of psychic life. Well, I think they're wrong, and they're wrong about something very important. To me, the great beauty and the great promise of Plato, the great hope that Plato holds out, is precisely his wondrous synthesis or harmonization of these elements of the psyche. The overarching theme of this series, of course, is that Plato's teaching offers precisely a remedy to this problem of self-division, which is the fundamental problem, as I've said in earlier episodes, that we humans face as human. This may sound a bit extreme or even perhaps a bit kooky, but I actually think the synthesis Plato worked out is the best hope that we human beings have for peace and happiness, both individually and communally. But there's something about our modern perspective that really kind of blocks us, I think, from seeing this. Something that I think we see surfacing in these two opinions on Plato that we've been looking at today. I think we should probably be quite concerned about that. Not so much about these two opinions, but the modern assumption that underlies them and kind of pushes them to the surface. This is what I'll be talking about in my next episode. So I hope you can join me then. And until then, be well and thanks for watching.